Good evening, everybody, and welcome, and thanks for joining us at the Royal College of Nursing for this year's annual History of Nursing lecture. I'm Diane Yarwood. I'm the chair of the History of Nursing Forum, and any member of the RCN who happens to be here who's interested in the history of nursing, can I encourage you to join the forum? It's very interesting and informative and educative, and a jolly good thing. The forum's aims are to protect, preserve and support an interest in the history of nursing. And some of the ways that we do that are by engagement with the library and museum, planning and presenting events such as this. And on your tables you've got leaflets there about the current exhibition. If you haven't already done so, I do encourage you to have a look or come back on another day and have a look at our exhibitions. We also have a significant and impressive activity on Wikipedia, where we are increasing the presence of information about women and nurses. But before I introduce our speaker, I have to do the housekeeping. There are no fire alarm tests planned for today, so if the alarm does go, please exit the building either through the doors on the right or your left or the back of the hall. There are toilets through the doors on your left, down the stairs or the lift, and also out through the back of the hall. We will be recording tonight's event, and it will be available at a as yet to be determined later date, which you can access it online. So I come to introducing Dr. Jane Brooks. She's a senior lecturer in the School of Health Sciences at the University of Manchester. And amongst her many publications, she's editor of Nursing History Review. She was the co-editor of 100 Years of Wartime Nursing Practices. And in 2015, she and her co-editor, Dr. Christine Hallett, were recipients of the Mary M. Roberts Award from the American Association for the History of Nursing. In 2018, her monograph, Negotiating Nursing, British Army Sisters and Soldiers in the Second World War, was published. Jane has also published many articles across a spectrum of related topics. She's a prolific writer and researcher. She's been an active member of the History of Nursing Forum for more years than she cares to remember, and has been a member of the Forum Steering Committee and a member of many UK, European and American history of nursing groups. Her latest monograph, Jewish Refugees and the British Nursing Profession, A Gendered Opportunity, was published in 2024 and awarded the Lavinia Dock Prize, also from the American Association for the History of Nursing. Excuse me. There will be an opportunity for questions after we hear from Jane, but without further ado, and another cough, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Jane Brooks. Thank you, Jane.
Well, I'd like to start by thanking the RCN, the History of Nursing Forum, and Diane for the invitation to give this annual lecture. It is a real honour, so thank you. From enemy, alien to valued worker, Jewish refugees and their nursing lives during the Second World War, and I'm even shorter than Diane, so I've got to just drop that down. In fact, I'm just really short. When war was declared on the 3rd of September 1939, the population of Britain expected bombs and immediate danger to life. According to the military historian Brian Bond, within minutes of the announcement that Britain was at war, air raid sirens created pandemonium in Whitehall, and the public was sent scurrying for inadequate shelter. All the sirens were false alarms. Allied forces and civilians were prepared for war, but nothing happened for the first 10 months. The period soon became known as the phony war. It was a time of war without war. Civil defence systems were organised, civilians were employed to work within the air raid precautions, but there was little for them to do. With war geographically removed from Britain and in the absence of aerial bombardment, life for most of the population changed little in those early months. The declaration of war did, however, change the status of Jewish refugees in Britain. Those who'd fled the Greater Reich were no longer refugees to be pitied, but enemy aliens. To the average British person, they were German. British authorities assumed all refugees were faithful to their homeland and therefore not to be trusted. According to refugee historian Colin Holmes, the government ordered an immediate review of all German and Austrians living in Britain. Having collected details of the aliens, and this is a term I will use because this is what they were called, all the government needed to do was categorise them into designations based on their potential danger to the country. Category A, persons were interned. Category B were left at liberty but had certain restrictions placed upon them. Category C were persons certified as refugees from Nazi oppression and freed from restrictions other than those applied to friendly aliens. Only 2 of the refugees whose stories are included in my story here were interned. Elizabeth Katz and Margaret Hodge were both designated Category B. It's unclear why they were categorised as more potentially dangerous than other nursing refugees. It is likely that the designations were arbitrary and dependent to some extent on the official considering the case. There's also some suggestion it might be because they were in the north of England, but we can talk about that later. Even those placed in Category C, however, could not be assured fair treatment from the British public. So this talk explores the wartime lives and work of female Jewish refugees who'd fled Nazi Europe for safety and worked as nurses in British hospitals. My talk begins with a brief description of their entry into Britain as refugees. This is followed by consideration of their position as they negotiated dismissal, internment, reinstatement within the gendered expectations of women's place during the conflict. I consider the scapegoating of Jews in Britain and the impact of the public's anti-Semitism on refugee nurses. Finally, I explore the relaxation of employment regulations for refugees and the influx into nursing of those who'd arrived on domestic service visas and the Kindertransport. By the latter years of the 1930s, the British government were concerned that war was imminent and there was a severe shortage of nurses. The wives of the British middle class were also concerned about the shortage of domestic servants as war work started to take precedence for young working class girls. The lack of nurses was a grave concern enough for the government, which began to work with the nursing profession to recommend it as a suitable means of escape for female Jews eager to flee Nazi persecution. Visa systems were therefore established and a Department of Nursing and Midwifery was created at Bloomsbury House in London as a subsidiary to the Council for Refugees. Approximately 20,000 women escaped on domestic service visas and about 1,000 on nursing and midwifery. However, as I will discuss, once restrictions on wartime work for refugees were lifted as the war progressed, nursing was seen as a way to escape domestic service and an opportunity for independence for those girls who had fled on the Kindertransport. When war was declared, those refugees working as hospital nurses, including Elizabeth, were able to continue their employment. The majority were working in and around London, but some others had been sent to the Midlands and some as far north as Yorkshire. There also were some in Scotland. However, despite their continued employment, there were clear signs of their change in status, as a number of restrictions were imposed, including a 5-mile radius, prohibitions on cycling, the requirement to register as an enemy alien, and a night curfew. The refugees' narratives do not dwell on these physical restrictions. Their work as nurses was heavily prescribed, and there was little time for leisure pursuits. Nevertheless, the new designation of enemy alien did have a psychological impact on them. In her memoir, Trudy Moose recalled the pain of being labelled an enemy alien, as nobody could have been more grateful to England than we were. Alice Fink noted the shock of the label, but acknowledged the very real fear of invasion. Both Moose and Margaret Marflow recalled the personal struggles they experienced as being considered German by the English. Given the trauma of exile, it is not surprising young Jewish nurses were hurt by the nomenclature. But when France fell to the German army in June 1940, the psychological responses to their change of status would be matched by a very real and profound alteration in their physical condition. In 1940, the report of the Central Council for Refugees was cautious in its description of the dire situation in which many refugees found themselves after the fall of France. The Jewish and Christian councils do not think it right to oppose the general government policy. Instead, it acknowledged that reports of treachery by German residents in the Netherlands and France that had aided the fall of France had brought about a change of feeling and policy in England. Under the stress of intern the lot, the government felt compelled to disregard the distinction that had been made in the favour of refugees. The imminent possibility of invasion was a factor in this change of outlook. On the 1st of May 1940, a special meeting of the Executive Council of the Central Council, Executive of the Central Council for Jewish Refugees recorded its concern over the loss of employment for refugee doctors, dentists, nurses and professional men, who were not at present allowed to engage in their normal vocations. The committee acknowledged that at the present time nothing could be done to alleviate the problem. And I find it really interesting to note the inclusion of nurses in this list of professional men. Nurses were women in an occupation that sat in the interstices between the learned professions and family carers or domestic servants. And this is the only document I found that places refugee nurses alongside male doctors, dentists as equals. But as employees in the nation's hospitals, unlike most of their compatriots, refugee health workers were both visible to the public and potentially had access to members of the armed forces. Their dismissal was part of the strategy to placate the populace who were fearful of spies. A few weeks later, on the 25th of May 1940, the news section of the Nursing Times announced that all hospitals and similar institutions must send details to the Alien War Service Department of all German, Austrian and Czech females employed in any capacity. A month later, on the 15th of June 1940, both Nursing Mirror and Midwives Journal, hereafter just the Nursing Mirror, and the Nursing Times reported that all German, Austrian and Czech nurses had to be dismissed from their hospital positions. On the 22nd of June, the Nursing Times printed a letter offering sympathy to those alien nurses who'd been dismissed. This has involved 800 to 900 nurses, many of whom are friendly to this country. While we all recognise that our national safety must be protected, we offer our sympathy to all those nurses who share our ideals. They will understand as well as we do the essential need for care in the very difficult position now facing us. Despite the words of sympathy, it is clear that the profession was unable to counter the edict that all refugees from Germany, Austria and Czechoslovakia must be dismissed. In July 1940, a letter to the Nursing Times again reported that the Minister of Health had decided all persons of either sex of German, Austrian or Italian nationality who are engaged in any capacity at any hospital in the emergency system which provides treatment for members of the armed forces must still be dismissed. The letter continued that in those hospitals where the forces were not being treated, alien personnel could be retained, and those of Czech nationality did not need to be dismissed from any hospital. In reality, the vast majority of alien personnel were dismissed. Matrons did not take into account their Czech nurses' provenance. Aviva Wolf was dismissed from the Princess Margaret Rose Hospital in Edinburgh because of fears of refugees so close to the Firth of Forth. She returned to London seeking new opportunities across the capital. Susie Loeffler recalled the matron of the cottage hospital where she was working, telling her that she had to leave. And the matron said to me, after about 2 months, I can't remember how long, she said, "We can't have enemy aliens in this hospital." Loeffler replied that she was not an enemy alien, that she had a Czech passport, but to no avail. She was on her own again. Josephine Bruegel, also Czechoslovakian, was working at a convalescent home in Bognor Regis when the British Expeditionary Force fled the continent. And then came Dunkirk, and I was on the south coast. All the nurses who were not British had to leave. I was called to the matron. A policeman was waiting there for me to take me to the police station. I asked why. I am a Czechoslovakian citizen. I belong to the Czech Refugee Trust Fund, and they know me. Before you imprison me, you better contact them, which they did. The Czech Czech Trust Fund told the police to put me on a train and send me straight to London. At the London hospital where Elizabeth Hockey was training, was evacuated to Rochford in Essex soon after the declaration of war. Her time there was short-lived. She reflected on her position, first having been forced out of her medical studies in Austria and now from her nursing studies in Britain. It was the second time that my career had been abruptly broken, without my intervention and totally beyond my control. Annie Atchell was dismissed from her training hospital in Ealing. In her oral history, she recalled the day that France fell to the Germans. "I shall never forget the day when one knew that Paris had fallen. That was the end of the world as far as I was concerned." On the declaration of war, only those in Category A were interned, but fear of spies after the fall of France led to more draconian measures against refugees. Most of the refugees were Jewish, and this only added to anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic and anti-refugee rhetoric. Sonia O'Rose, the historian, maintains that Jews in wartime Britain were accused of engaging in selfish actions simply because they were Jewish and therefore un-British and un-English. Jews threatened the national identity and were therefore to be treated with suspicion. Young women refugee nurses were not viewed as suspect as their male compatriots, but they were not immune to public fears of the enemy within. One bright moonlit night during her nursery nurse training, Marion Parks left nappies on the washing line. They were seen by RAF pilots and she was reported to the police for trying to signal to the enemy. He, the policeman, decided I was too stupid to be a spy, and so they let me go. The lack of understanding of the plight that Jews had under Hitler meant that the British public were able to believe Jewish refugees in Britain were Nazi spies. The right-wing press, in particular, fed into fears of the population, while the government did little to calm the rising panic. The British press and security forces called for all enemy aliens to be interned. All those in Category B were located and sent to internment camps. Only about 4,000 women were interned compared to 23,000 men. The majority were sent to the Isle of Man in keeping with gendered ideas of women's general acquiescence to authority. They were treated more leniently than the male internees. Nevertheless, the experience of being arrested and shipped off to an island was challenging to these young women. Having been placed in the B category at the beginning of the war, Elizabeth Katz joined other interned women on the Isle of Man. Then just before Dunkirk, and I was called, and they just grabbed everybody, and put them into camps. And that's how I ended up on the Isle of Man, being shipped there in the middle of the night. I was working, and I was called to the administration. There were these people who were detectives or something, and I had to pack my stuff up, and I had to go with them. There was another refugee girl in the same hospital. She was there too. We were physically taken care of, but we had no idea where we were going or what would become of us. Margaret Hodge had found nursing work at Killingbeck Hospital for TB patients, having been dismissed from her training at St James's Hospital in Leeds. In May 1940, the matron and police officer arrived at Hodge's bedroom. Hodge was told to pack a small bag and escorted to Leeds Town Hall basement, where other Jewish refugees were gathered. They were taken on buses to Liverpool. Hodge recalls the journey itself. Our trip to the Isle of Man was horrific. The ship, a Belgian coaster, capable of transporting at most 250 people, was full to bursting. She did not look seaworthy and was filthy. There was no order and no discipline. It was first come, first serve. I found a bit of floor space in front of a toilet that was in constant use and stank to high heaven. There were Jewish refugees and hard-bitten Nazis all clumped together on one ship. Katz remembers docking on the Isle of Man, though at the time she did not know where they were. She admitted they were apprehensive. But the refugees soon found themselves in a resort town with beautiful beaches and hotels into which they were dispatched. She spent 9 months on the island and even had her 21st birthday there. Not used to forced idleness, the interned women organised themselves to provide useful skills to fellow internees, including teaching, hairdressing, medical care, language courses and dramatic productions. As student nurses, Katz and Hodge's skills were sought after, and they were both worked as nurses throughout their internment. Hodge remained critical of internment procedure, but admitted she learnt much in her nursing work. In her oral history, Katz voiced a greater acceptance of her internment, seeing the policy as necessary to move to prevent spies. One can only speculate if she was so tolerant of her treatment at the time. I would argue it's possible that the overlaying of 80 years of composing herself first as a British citizen and then an American one, and thus perhaps desire to appreciate the perspective of Allied governments, was central to the creation of this positive trope. Holocaust historian Tony Kushner argues that in many accounts of internment there is a sense that it was a period of temporary aberration in an understandable moment of panic. Most of the refugee nurses tried to demonstrate gratitude to Britain for offering refuge rather than criticising the government for blanket decision to intern them, and particularly for this project dismiss all nurses and doctors. However, there were refugees at the time who openly questioned the decision to dismiss them from their hospital training programmes. In August 1940, A refugee wrote to Nursing Mirror describing herself as just an alien nurse. She expressed her dismay at being dismissed from her nurse training school. We are sent away from hospitals because we are aliens, but we were turned out of our native country because we were enemies of the Nazi regime. In November that same year, Nursing Mirror published another letter in which a refugee nurse sent a heartfelt plea to the hospitals of Britain. I thought I was very lucky to get to England at last. Then in June this year, I received a letter saying I had to leave the hospital as well as the town in 3 days. Destroyed were all my hopes and plans, destroyed all my feelings of having a home. Even amongst these entreaties, the desire to appease the profession and government is apparent. Another refugee who also identified herself as just an alien nurse wrote to Nursing Mirror on the 29th of June. She stated she appreciated the decision to keep aliens out of hospitals that treated military patients, noting, however, but there is a great demand for nurses just now. We could relieve British nurses for war work from county, mental, fever and general hospitals. We would be only too pleased to do any kind of nursing. Most refugees in the end returned to domestic work to maintain their financial independence, and their discussions of the dismissal period are limited. This is possibly because most were invited to return to nursing within a few months, and their dismissals were largely forgotten in the extensive wartime effort. I would argue it's also likely that refugees did not want to remember a time in which they were once again treated as the enemy and returned to working in other people's homes. Both Tony Kushner and David Cesarani maintained that once internment finished, most refugees needed to manage their lives and the war. Those who'd been dismissed from their employment probably felt the same. On the 29th of August 1940, the General Committee of the Nursing and Midwifery Department at Bloomsbury House passed a unanimous resolution on refugee nurses' employment. The Committee of the Nursing and Midwifery Department asked the earnest consideration of the Home Office may be given to this request that refugee nurses removed from their hospital under Circular 2080 may be allowed to return and remain as long as the matron is satisfied with their conduct to such hospitals as can make arrangements for their working in wards in which sailors, soldiers and airmen of the HM forces will not be admitted. As early as July 1940, Nursing Mirror reported that aliens could return to nursing work provided they did not work in hospital where there were service personnel. That August that year, the Nursing Midwifery Department acknowledged the support of the General Nursing Council in helping those refugees who were moved to hospitals not recognised by them as training schools. 2 months later, general hospitals started to relax restrictions. On the 18th of October 1940, Miss Frey, secretary to the department, wrote to Mr. E.N. Cooper of the Home Office. Frey informed him that the situation within the London County Council, LCC, hospitals had altered. LCC hospitals were now willing to accept Czech refugees back into its establishments. An anonymous letter to Nursing Mirror on the 9th of November acknowledged that aliens may nurse again. According to Frey, the LCC also agreed that German and Austrian nurses could return to hospitals for the chronically sick as assistant nurses, providing those hospitals did not admit military personnel. This latter form of employment is, of course, not training, but in this way our candidates will be able to take a share in the country's need for nurses, and it will also enable them to continue their practical experience. It also enabled the nursing profession and the government to staff unpopular hospitals cheaply. Eva Flatoff found work in a psychiatric hospital. Banned from working in a general hospital, she was assigned to work in a mental asylum. This she found unbearable. This is from an oral history I spoke to her son. Carrying a bunch of keys to interlocked wards, never knowing what disturbed behaviour she would have to deal with. But there she made friends with a fellow refugee, and together they took French leave and found work in London in a private nursing home. Whilst in London, Flatoff met a fellow Jewish immigrant, and they were married the following year. She did not return to nursing. In September 1940, Hockey had also returned to nursing, having been given a position at a fever hospital in London. In her oral history, she suggests she was offered this work during the Blitz because it was dangerous. After 9 months being interned on the Isle of Man, Elizabeth Katz returned to St Luke's Hospital in Bradford. And I was told that St Luke's would have me back, and an arrangement was made with the board of nursing that we could step back into our training. Hodge returned back to St James's, but they would only credit her with 3 months of previous training. Apart from that, she had to do the full 3 years. She recalled how helpless and disappointed she was, as it was the 3rd time she'd had to begin her nursing career. I had 15 months in Germany, started again in England in 1939, been transferred to a fever hospital in 1940, had been taken to the Isle of Man, had been nursing there, gaining experience, and it all accounted for very little. Though Hodge acknowledged the value of her nursing work and the training that was being provided, her memoir brings into stark relief the opportunism of the profession. By ensuring she started at the beginning again, St James's acquired her skills for additional years at a lower pay scale. Margaret Marflow's memoir recalled her personal feelings about the return of Jewish refugee nurses to hospitals in Britain. A few months later, there was an acute shortage of nursing, and someone remembered these redundant refugee nurses, and the London County Council decided to take many of us on. Marflow started her nurse training, or restarted her nurse training at St Mary's Hospital in Islington. By the time I'd restarted training at St Mary's, my father had returned from internment, and slowly we became acclimatised, that is to say, British. Also, we became acclimatised to the war, the bombing, the rationing, and all the hardships, including fire watching. Annie Atchell also decided to return to nursing despite not enjoying the work. She applied to Epsom Hospital as they were seeking assistant nurses, but after about a month she was asked to take up her nurse training. I said I didn't think I would because I wouldn't be there very long. But they prevailed, and we were 8, I think, who started at the same time. What happened from then on was people who I think hadn't gone into nursing, people who would normally have gone to university, who would normally have done other jobs. Many of them chose nursing because they had to go into these things. She did not consider her training at Epsom a great success, but wartime training. Atchell was not alone in this analysis of nurse training during the war years. In January 1942, Susie Loeffler also returned to nursing, obtaining a training place at Harefield Hospital in northwest London. Well, I did have my eyes open on the first day. I had to walk a long day on the children's ward. All TB, 60 patients. We were 2 nurses. Quite a few of them couldn't get up. They were on plaster beds, TB spines. We had to do everything, no help at all. As it was Christmas, nobody could get a day off, and 12-hour shifts. That was the first and only time in my life I fainted. With the relaxation of regulations, refugees who'd been working as domestic servants were able to move into nursing or other war work. For those who'd come as kinder but were now 18 years old were also eligible to train as nurses. Lee Fisher was working as a maid in Manchester when she decided she would do something for war effort and applied to Booth Hall Children's Hospital for a place to train as a children's nurse. Hortense Gordon left her work as a domestic servant in 1941 and started children's nurse training at Queen Mary's Hospital, Carshalton. Silly Haar also left her domestic service position to train as a nurse in 1942, beginning at City General Hospital in Gloucester. However, ill health and a broken relationship sent her back to London, where she began her training again in 1943 at Lambeth Hospital, which is part of the LCC. Nursing may have been better than domestic service, though only because anything was. War work was, however, hard for all nurses, with limited time off. Working through the Blitz added bombs to their workload and war work to their free time. In her oral history, Hockey recalled her work in the fever hospital. Most of our patients were children. On night duty during the Blitz, they nursed children on the floor under their cots, so the bottom of the cot was their shelter. Hockey continued, "There was a great bang one morning, I remember that to this day, and the kids screaming, and the bombs dropping, and the parents being killed, and the kids being left in hospital because there was no one to take them home. Their homes had been bombed." The Blitz began on the 7th of September 1940 and continued for 10 months. Histories of the Blitz are by now legend, the Blitz spirit holding a special place in the narrative of war on the home front. According to historian Angus Calder, as heavy bombing of London began in the late summer, the word Blitz became almost overnight a British colloquialism for an air raid. As Hockey's recollection above the test, nurses, like much of the civilian population, both struggled with the realities of the situation and accepted the conditions as being part of war. The call to the country to get on with life as normal a way as possible. Such internalising of the Blitz spirit was vital to the nation's resolve. Government propaganda sent Britain's ability to withstand the onslaught of the Luftwaffe as the country standing together in recognition of a common enemy. The need to manage in this time of crisis was critical for the young nurses caring for the nation's sick and in need. Gertrude Roberts may have argued that the World War did not intrude on her nurse training, but she still accepted there was community spirit. Trudy Moose recalled the challenges of living through bombing raids and caring for young children when the air raid siren sounded. Yet she maintained, "I felt we were all in this together. How different from years in Germany when I was one of the despised minority group." Healthcare workers across the country pulled together to support a nation under fire. The Blitz impacted significantly on the work of nurses across the country, both on and off duty. Lee Fisher maintained night duty was better than day duty because at least they were already awake when the bombs fell. If we were on days and an air raid was on, we had to go on duty and put the children under the bed. And of course, matron was very fussy to make sure we were all dressed properly. That was very important. No bobby pins in the hair or whatever. So we preferred to be on night duty because we were up already. During the day, you know, we needed our sleep. At night, when we had the air raids, it was a difficult time, but we didn't analyse it. We just took it for what it was. The Blitz not only gave nurses extra work, but in some instances altered the way patients were cared for in material ways. Hockey recalled the work during this time in the fever hospital. The whole fever hospital, with glass partitions in between, and we were supposed to go out of the cubicle and leave all your things and wash your hands, disinfect your hands, then go into the next cubicle, out through the door, into the next cubicle, put the gown on and all that. And that was the strictest thing we had to obey. There was no relaxation on that regime, ever, ever, ever. Always had to do that. And then when the Blitz came, glass partitions were all taken down because of the glass, danger of broken glass. And the people popped from one cubicle to another and nothing happened, no cross-infection. I've not located any data that conceded a direct impact of the Blitz on the decision to allow Jewish refugees to resume nursing. However, once readmitted, hospitals promptly took advantage of their presence. The refugees' return to hospital work was not limited to patient care. Refugee nurses were deemed sufficiently trustworthy not only to return to the profession, but also to engage in the various forms of unpaid war work expected of the whole population. Air raid precaution work had been established pre-war in anticipation of aerial bombardment. Historian Susan Grazel argues that a vast amount of propaganda was directed towards the women of Britain to take on the mantle of protecting the nation at home as war workers, air raid wardens and fire watchers. 200,000 civilians were enrolled in the ARP. On the 14th of September 1942, the Fire Prevention Business Premises No. 3 order, which included women in the fire watching service, came into force. According to exemption rules, whole-time nurses and midwives were exempt, but it does not appear to apply to nurses in training. Nursing in the fever hospital, Hockey recalled, "We had all these different buildings for different diseases that were scattered throughout a very large complex. We used to have to go from one to another to do fire watching. It was all very fascinating experience, quite dangerous." Hockey's somewhat spirited analysis of the danger and fascination inherent in it belied the fear that she and the nation felt at the possible incursion of German forces. Trudy Moose admitted her greatest fear was the possibility of German parachutes being dropped onto British soil. For the refugees, the thought of a German invasion must have been terrifying. Many were only too aware of the situation their families and friends were in Nazi territories. Even as the Blitz came to an end, no one could be quite sure that it had. Anxieties remained high, as its purpose, thinking that its purpose might be to soften the country in preparation for an invasion. But the Blitz ended in the spring of 1941 as Hitler turned his attention to Russia. The war continued into its third year. With so many British qualified nurses volunteering for military service, great responsibility was placed on probationer student nurses. In the absence of modern treatments and drugs, particularly penicillin, a probationer nurse's work was physical, arduous, and sometimes technically demanding. The loss of men to the forces and working-class women to the factories meant that nursing staff needed to undertake orderly and ward domestic duties as well. Whilst nursing was nominally a profession, the lack of academic study and requirements to do domestic work added to its unpopularity amongst British young women. Few hospitals even had any sort of preliminary training for probation nurses. Their work on the ward started immediately, and this usually meant menial tasks for the first few months. In her oral history, Edith Byrne was asked, "Was there any teaching before you went on the wards?" Her reply, "No, of course not. Straight to the wards." She continued, "I don't know about the training. I don't know what the sluice is like now, but it was pretty grim." Mia Ross recalled arriving at the nurses' home at the Keighley and Victoria Hospital and being shown to her room. The very next day, she was sent to matron's office for a short interview and from there straight to the children's ward. She admitted that the work was hard and the hours long. I was not used to physical work, being on your feet all day, so I got very tired and I had no trouble sleeping. But you know, there was a war on and everyone had to work hard, so you carried on. By 1942, Ross passed her preliminary examination and moved into her second year. Now, with more responsibility, she was expected to take her turn on medical and surgical wards. I have a vivid memory of those days when penicillin was discovered but not available to use. Patients who had pneumonia usually suffered a crisis, and that happened in the early hours of the morning. Some managed to conquer it and survive, others did not and died. Without antibiotics, they just had basically good nursing care and the sulfonamides. You were given a patient to care for and you cared for that patient. You did everything that patient needed. Hortense Gordon recalled the chronically ill children and the time-consuming nursing care they required total care. The need for nurses on the home front continued even as the bombs ceased. Nursing was seen as a valuable contribution for women towards the war effort. As the war progressed into its middle years, more refugees turned to the profession as a means of independence. On the 1st of January 1942, Trudy Moose started her training at the Royal Free Hospital in London. Unlike Ross, who trained at a small local hospital, entering a major London teaching hospital meant that Moose was able to spend the first 8 weeks in the preliminary training school learning fundamental nursing skills. Moose was impressed with the system, describing Miss Sheehan as a good tutor who gave us lots of useful instruction during the first weeks of the preliminary training school. It was also a time in which she was able to develop good friendships with her colleagues. Once on the wards, Moose accepted that the work was hard, though interesting, and the patients friendly. Like Moose, other refugee nurses continued with their training, working alongside their British counterparts, helping the population of the country manage their wartime illnesses and injuries. War work for all nurses, refugees and their British colleagues was hard and demanding, with little free time and in many cases limited educational output. However, despite the assertion of several refugee nurses they were all in it together, it is clear that they had a far more challenging time than their British colleagues. The refugee nurses had to manage great shifts in culture and language, from their lives in continental Europe to the New World in the British hospital. They needed to cope with anti-Jewish and anti-German and anti-refugee hostility. More important, they needed to live with the knowledge of the situation in Nazi territories, the dwindling contact with their families left behind, and the almost certain knowledge of their deaths. Reports of their families' deportations and deaths infiltrated their lives in a devastating manner. Most hospitals did not really understand. Byrne was the only refugee and Jew at her hospital in Northern Ireland, a country ridden with sectarian hatred between the Catholics and Protestants. She thought she had made one friend, the only Protestant student nurse in the hospital. And she said, "I'm going to see my grandmother. Would you like to come with me?" And then we got to the front door. She said, "You'll have to wait out here. My grandmother wouldn't like a German Jew to come in." So I waited an hour and she visited. And the other thing, she invited me to her wedding. And then 3 days before the wedding, she said, "My parents don't want you to come." That was my friend. I had no one. This part of her oral history is not full of the stories of torture and murder and brutality that form many narratives of Holocaust survival. But it was one which I found particularly difficult to read. The absence of all that a young woman's life should have, home, family, kindness, are replaced with the harsh realities of anti-Semitic and anti-foreign actions, and by the person she thought was her friend. Even if other refugees did not describe such stark forms of alienation, they experienced challenges brought about by estrangement from family and home. Hockey admitted, "I had no home, no money or anything. I was totally dependent on my nursing livelihood for everything." The matron's report from her early training period at the London acknowledged that when she received a message to say her father had died, she was greatly distressed about this and much concerned about her mother. In consequence, her health suffered. Unlike British girls who could leave nursing if they did not like it and return home, visit their parents, whatever, refugee nurses had limited alternatives and no family to return to. Hockey could not go home. She never saw her parents again. Despite the multiple hardships, refugees were keen to show that they were part of the war effort, as essential to the Allies as their British nursing colleagues. Gertrude Roberts maintained when she began her nurse training, "And still the war did not intrude. Being Jewish didn't intrude. I was kind of beginning at the beginning." Later in her oral history, she recalls the reality of life as a junior probationer, in which they had to scrub bedpans, I had to scrub bed wheels, I had to do all sorts of menial works which weren't pleasant. I remember lying practically on my stomach under bed, cleaning bed wheels while the doctors were doing their rounds. It was very demeaning again. The unwillingness to lay the blame on the British for the situation they were in reverberates across many refugees' narratives. Marion Bergen describes being grateful for as a recurrent theme used by the older generation. Refugees were encouraged to be thankful to Britain that had saved their lives. Much of what Roberts described was the experience of every probationer, yet the demeaning again moment of lying on her stomach, cleaning under the beds during the doctor's round, echoes the humiliation of Jews in Nazi territories who were forced to clean streets on their hands and knees. The impact of being estranged in these ways placed the experience of refugee nurse in war in a very different space to her different British colleagues. The horror of their situation multiplied as they began to realise their parents had been murdered. For Ross, the ongoing terror of war and reduction in correspondence with her parents, coupled with rumours of atrocities, were recalled with increasing emotion. This is very difficult to put into words. I had a letter from my sister Liesl telling me my parents had been transported to Minsk and presumed dead. I was so shocked I told nobody in the hospital. As Ross took her preliminary exams to enter her second year of training, she received one of the last messages from her parents in which they wished me luck in my exams. Silly Haar commenced her nurse training. Before Silly Haar commenced her nurse training, she regularly received Red Cross messages from her parents, until I had the last message, and I was already in Gloucester as a probationer nurse. We were about to go on a journey where our friends were. That was Poland. I knew what they meant. In her oral history, Haar immediately moved to talk about her brother's life, unable to dwell on the unbearable sadness. But Haar may not have been able to speak about her words of grief, but in her memoir she recalled, I knew I would never hear from my family again, but I always, even now I have the hope my sister is alive, somewhere, though extensive searching has proved negative. In the next line, she immediately returns to happier thoughts. Despite this news, I tried to get on with my life as best I could under the circumstances. I was as happy as I could be. I led a very full life, and I liked nursing very much. Most refugees, this period was one of challenges, extreme sadness, and a real sense of fracture in their young lives. However, the war years also laid foundations for their future careers. Towards the end of her general training, Annie Atchell considered what sort of work she wanted to do. In her oral history, she spoke of a ward sister with whom she worked, who had a sister at Mill Hill Emergency Psychiatric Hospital. The ward sister asked Atchell if she would be interested in applying for her psychiatric training. Atchell commenced at Mill Hill in 1944 and stayed there until moving back to the Maudsley at the end of the war. I certainly knew I would stay the moment I arrived at Mill Hill. She admitted she enjoyed everything about the war. I enjoyed the feeling of being expected to contribute something, but certainly it was the patients rather than that caused me to feel I had a future in psychiatric nursing. But according to Peter Nolan, Mill Hill was critical for Atchell in other ways. He commented on how the Jewish community, the importance of the Jewish community at Maudsley was to her, where open discussions were like a Jewish prayer meeting. Several of the refugees whose narratives form this study created spaces for themselves in other areas of the nursing profession, routes that would be their life's work. Rarely were these places in the rigid world of the General Hospital. Edith Bowen went to Liverpool's Tropical School of Medicine. Rosa Saccharine was given an opportunity to enter a symposium on child psychology. She stated, and I felt totally lost. The language was something I simply did not understand. What were they all talking about? Eager to follow these new ideas, she was fortunate to find a book on the shelves in the nurses' recreation room. She asked the sister tutor if she could borrow it, and it was the first time anybody had ever asked for a book. That got me really interested in psychology. Saccharine eventually became an expert in children's nursing and published several books on the subject, and also was an examiner for the GNC. To conclude, the declaration of war on the 3rd of September did change the lives of many women in Britain, though it was not the watershed moment that has been suggested. Women may have been encouraged and then conscripted into spaces usually reserved for men, but mostly their lives persisted within the gendered accepted system. Nursing was considered a critical profession for women's support of the war effort. For refugee nurses, the 6 years of war were a time of stark contrasts. In 1938, they were wooed by the nursing leadership, who saw their presence as a valuable way to bolster the profession's numbers. With the fall of France, they were all dismissed. Less than 6 months later, the government and profession once again called on refugees to support the health of the nation, the war effort and return to nursing. Most willingly returned. For some, this was a real choice. They liked nursing. For others, it was pure pragmatism. They need to do something for the war effort, and nursing was better than some of the alternatives. The courting of refugees for the profession was clear opportunism on the part of the government and nursing leadership. Nevertheless, many refugees saw it as an opportunity and were pleased to be given the chance to support the Allied effort and train for profession at the same time. By the end of the war, several refugees were qualified and looking forward to a professional future. Despite the ongoing horror from which some could not distance themselves, most refugees accepted their place within the nursing profession and worked to support the post-war world and the birth of the National Health Service. Several established themselves as leaders in the profession in the latter years of the 20th century, and their legacies are still relevant today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. That was absolutely amazing. I've heard Jane speak about these ladies once before, and I remain amazed by the achievements of the women and also Jane's persistence in identifying these stories. Right, before we move on to questions, there is a roving mic, or there will be a mic roving. If you wish to answer a question, if you could raise your hand, let us know who you are, and yes, wait for the microphone to get to you, let us know who you are, and ask your questions. Hands. There's one at the back there.
Hello, my name is Amelia. I was just curious, what I have read about the World War II, it refers to Anne Frank, the Diary of Anne Frank. So my question is, for these young women in Britain who are Jewish and German, what did adolescence have to do with their approach to taking on work and restarting and starting over? And was it made, were the experiences, being internment and such, was it made at all difficult by some feelings of angst if they were younger about the age of Anne Frank?
That's a really interesting question. And I'm not sure I can really answer it. I'm not sure I entirely understood it. Are you asking whether the ideas about adolescence that Anne Frank raised sort of triggered memories for them? They rarely talk about such things. So my impression when occasionally they did, when some of the stories that came out about their escapes were pretty horrendous, and their stories about the death, and then my baby sister was transported to Auschwitz and I never saw her again. But they tended, when they told these stories, they tended to do it in a very, very matter-of-fact way. And I think that some of them had talked about their experiences before. Some of them were quite experienced at giving talks to school children and other groups about the Holocaust. And I think it was almost that they had a script so that they could manage to talk about the horror. And that's not in every case, but it was certainly something that I found. None of them really referred to the more general Holocaust experience. They talked about their families, they talked about people they loved, they talked about what it was like for them as restrictions in Germany before they fled became worse. But they didn't talk about what it's like to reflect back on it now. And I think that's because probably it was too traumatic. And we know a lot about what it's been like for the Holocaust generation, but also the second generation, and how they wouldn't talk to their children about it. And so I think it's a really complicated picture of both forgetting, ignoring, and remembering. And it's very much that the historian Penny Summerfield writes very eloquently about when people give an oral history, how they compose their story, and I think very often these women compose the story that they felt they could manage to tell. So thank you for that question.
Somebody else. Gents. Yes, please. Your name. Just tell us who you are.
Yeah, so Anthony Brennan, I work in the offshore energy industry in occupational health. Not really a question, but more of an observation, really, about history repeating itself, about the readmission of the nurses when they found they were short. During the COVID crisis, the NMC suddenly found it convenient to state that their standards were flexible, which is a bit of a contradiction in terms, really, and that any nurses who wanted to return to the profession who'd been off the register needn't worry about sort of being out of date with their practices and so forth. It just shows really how they can change the rules when it suits them. More of a rant really than a question.
Well, I think it has always been thus. I think that when there is a crisis, there will always be a rallying cry, and what is normal will be altered. And I think that happens when my other work prior to this, which is very much about British Army nurses on active service, they would be doing things on active service that no one would let them anywhere near in a British hospital, but needs must. And I think there is a level of needs must. And these women, you know, probably we don't actually know how many of them became nurses by the end of the war. There was about 1,000 in 1940. It's possible that there were nearer 2,000 or 3,000 who'd moved from either being kinder into nursing or from domestic service. If the boys who came over on the kinder transport were clever, some of them could go to university. That was never an option for the girls. Nursing was seen as the option for clever girls. So I think there were maybe there were 3,000 by the end. So it certainly became something that was quite popular. And they were there, and they were willing to do it. And in some ways, I hate to say it, they were kind of a captive audience, because they had nowhere else to go. They weren't going to shenanigan off and go for a hoolie and be naughty, because if they left the hospital, they had nothing. You know, there wasn't a mummy or daddy to pick them up. So I think they were a useful group. And they were markedly more cultured and educated than many British nurses at the time. So they were a real coup, especially for some of the less prestigious hospitals.
I was just thinking the harsh reality is there never have been enough nurses to provide the care that we require. You know, there were, 40,000 shortage in 1948 at the launch of the NHS?
Yeah.
So, anyway, that's a different subject altogether.
Thank you for the wonderful talk, Professor. I'm a student at King's College, and I'm doing my Master's in War Studies, and I'm looking at letter and diary exchanges, so I was quite interested in your book. So I was wondering how you kind of navigated the process of research. Was it more to do with archival work? And if it were, how did you go about it? Did you get access to their letters or diaries, or how was it?
A really good question, and it's lovely to hear somebody who's interested in the art, in the actual methodology of it. So I work, and have always worked in personal testimony. I think since I did my PhD, which was a few years ago. And I'm really interested in how people narrate their stories. So, and how I've gone about having access to the stories is, so for my work on British Army nurses, I put adverts in, The Lady, which is now just disbanded, and People's Friend, and then word of mouth. So I did things with the RCN, who would then put stuff out through the History of Nursing Society. For this work, I put letters in the Association for Jewish Refugees magazine, and also the Jewish Chronicle. And people would... Then it was word of mouth, and I remember having emails from somebody in Canada. So my cousin saw your letter in the Jewish Chronicle, and my mother, who's sitting next to me, we live in Canada now, and she's 95, was a nurse refugee. So it kind of... in the end, for this project, I managed to interview 8. I think they are probably all dead now. But that was back in the 1917? Yeah, 2017, I was doing the interviews. And then people would say, I would get emails and people would say, well, my mother's dead, but I've got these letters would you like me to photocopy them and send them to you? Or I've got this, these documents that were my mother's. So just kind of, it's a bit serendipitous. And you just end up working with what you end up working with. And there are also, the Imperial War Museum does have some oral histories, and things like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. There are places around the world that do have oral histories. Some of them are even video. The Yale Fortunoff video archive for which is a Holocaust archive. They have videos which are oral histories which are really quite difficult to watch. So, all over.
Thanks. I think Vari had a hand up.
Hello, thank you. That was fantastic. My name's Vari Drennan. I'm Vice Chair of the History of Nursing Forum at the RCN. Got that right, thank you. Diane's nodding at me. My question follows on, which is rather neat, thank you. What I didn't get, so you've given in part the answer, so you interviewed yourself, eight people, but you drew on many more people's letters, published accounts. I just wondered if you could give us an idea of how many overall, thanks.
So I probably, in the end, I probably had about 15 or 20, maybe. God, now you're asking me a really difficult question. You asked me to count, and I can't possibly do that in a short space of time. But probably about 15 or 20 different women I was able to draw on. And then some others which I just basically had some very brief biographical data. So there's Paul Windling at Oxford Brookes, who's a professor of and Holocaust historian. He created a biographical database of Jewish refugee nurses and doctors, and I went and used his archive. He was very generous. The Wiener Library has a load of oral histories. There were some in the RCN. So it kind of went all over the country, really. And some of them were more detailed than others. And then some people, would just send me my mother. So my mother came over, and this is her entry document. So I went from that to Rosa Saccharin. There's a memoir, there's oral histories, there's other things written about her, to this is just a document, the whole thing. Thanks, Barry.
So it's a detective jigsaw.
Yes. That's
Yeah.
the phrase.
And don't let any opportunity pass you by. If somebody says, I think history is really interesting and I know it, just get them and say, right, sit down and talk to me. Yes.
And in fact, I was handed a family memoir just last week from the Wiener. A gentleman came, and his mother had been a refugee nurse, and he'd written a book about the whole family, including her, and he said, here you are. So things like that happened, which is rather nice.
I think there's one there.
Thank you. It's Catherine Tack, my name. I wanted to ask about the spiritual aspects of the refugees. Were they able to practice at all? They were forbidden, or what did take place?
That is a really good question. So, the short answer is really no. When the children arrived, they were put into holiday camps. There was one at Dovercourt, and they didn't even have kosher food. There was a hope that most children would go into Jewish families, but that was never possible. And in fact, there was one set of children came over via the Barbican Society, and actually the reason they said you can come if you convert to Christianity. That was one of the and you then think, okay, they've survived, but so the short answer is no. When they got to hospitals, there was absolutely nothing done for them. And in fact, Edith Bowen was told by one of the chaplains in her hospital in Northern Ireland that she would go to hell because she was a Jew. Because he asked why she wasn't in church on Sunday. But there was 2 women I interviewed who'd been at Staines Emergency Hospital, which was part of the Middlesex County system. And their matron was really, they think she had been married, it was a bit, but she was really forward thinking. She encouraged them to join the Socialist Medical Association because nurses were allowed to, and they encouraged Jewish refugees, both doctors and nurses, to join. And she allowed them to collect rations to do special food for patients who were Jewish and for themselves. And she tried to enable them to maintain their Judaism. But she's the only one I found Miss Lang, who was that forward thinking. And I think she was forward thinking about everything. Most of them, no, you're here now, work. And so they muddled through, but there was no, they didn't have bacon sandwiches. I mean, I think it was as simple as that. When it was breakfast and they got meat, they didn't have it, but it was pork. And they were allowed to refuse. But then they had nothing else, because of course there were rations, so then they were hungry. So it was a bit grim, in more ways than one.
I was just Celia Manson. I was just thinking, wondering if you have any idea of the numbers who became nurses who originally came as part of Kindertransports, or and whether those outnumber the others. I mean, you've talked quite a lot about Elizabeth Hockey, and I know she was studying medicine in, I think, Vienna before she came to the UK as a refugee. So, I mean, is it just a whole diverse pattern of things?
There were a lot of them. A lot of the women I interviewed and the ones whose oral histories are in, or documents are in public domain, a lot either wanted to be doctors, had ambitions to be doctors, or a couple of them were medical students. So Josephine Bruegel was in the last term of her medical studies when she had to leave Prague. But because they were very pragmatic, they said, well, I'm a woman, so I can't do medicine in Britain, because there was only one hospital in this country, in London, that would let them do that, and there weren't enough spaces. I was a refugee, and I had no money. So people suggested nursing. And some of them were quite positive about that. Hortense Gordon said, well, I'd been interested in medicine. I wanted to be a doctor. I didn't have to pay. I was interested in these things. I went into the nurses' home, so I was looked after. I got a uniform. I got fed. I got a community. It seemed like a sensible decision. Some of them weren't quite so sure about whether nursing was close enough to medicine to be ideal. But most of them accepted it as a sensible alternative. What we don't know is how. It would take a prosopographer to actually work out how many of the kinder went on and did hospital nursing. I don't know. The girls, I don't know. I wish I did. I think it'd be too difficult to find out.
Thank you very much, Jane. It's lovely. Just really as observation.
So who are you?
Yes.
Just because I know.
I'm Sue Yassi, member of the History of Nursing Forum. Just really an observation more than a question. Make a lovely talk for schools, I would have thought. I don't know if you've... A lovely talk for schools, possibly, I would have thought. I don't know if you've been asked.
No. I would have thought it'd be a bit too traumatic for children. I don't know, maybe not. Maybe perhaps children are more resilient than I give them credit. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Safari. Hang on, there's one there and then...
Thank you. Did you ever put any of the nurses you gathered together in touch with each other?
No, because you aren't allowed to do that. I had one nurse ask me about somebody and I said, I'm really sorry. You can't do it for GDPR reasons.
And did you manage to give them your book?
Yes, all those whose images I used and a couple of others got a free copy, which was a nice thing to be able to do. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity for a second question. And this is a really challenging one. So we look to the past to understand the present and think about the future. So anything from what you've been investigating you'd like to reflect now in a world of wars and refugees and health professionals escaping from different countries? Any thoughts? Or you can say no, I won't answer that.
The short answer is no, Vari, I'm not going to answer that, because I just think it's impossible. In the introduction to the book, I reflect and I say I want this to speak to current migrant situations, and I talk about, the healthcare surcharge that we've been charging nurses and doctors to work in this country. It's like, what? And I think about women coming here and wanting to nurse, and them not having the right qualifications because you didn't train in a Western country. And I think about them being sent to places that really aren't good place perhaps to learn how to nurse in this country. And I reflect on all of these things. And if I was Empress of the Universe, it would all be different, but I'm not.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Gosha.
Gosha Bryczynska. I just want to say that in a couple of weeks' time, I think, we'll be celebrating Refugee Week. And I remember one of the last things I did here at the Royal College, because I worked here for a while, was work with refugee nurses. And all I can say is that not a lot has really moved forward. And some of the biggest hurdles, of course, now, I don't know how it was, well, you told us how it was 70 years ago, but now the biggest problem was the standards set, or criteria set by the NMC, which the vast majority of refugee nurses just couldn't meet. So in the end, I can now say, because I'm retired and I don't care, but I used to say to the nurses, if you can, if you're young enough and strong enough, start again from the beginning. These were people, men and women, that were qualified nurses in their countries, working, as registered nurses. And I was actually telling them, it's easier for you to start from the beginning than trying to go through the NMC. I'm sorry, but I had to say that. And I think in a couple of instances it worked, but God, it must have been soul-destroying.
Okay, do we have a last question? No, right. So this is the thanks. Thank you so much, Jane, for coming all the way from the north to speak to us today. And Jane has mentioned, and I mentioned her book. She tells me it will be coming out in paperback in January. So early Christmas or late Christmas presents, maybe. So as I say, thank you. It's not difficult to find references to the importance of history. And I leave you with one from Winston Churchill, who in 1948 said, "Those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it." And that's come up here today, hasn't it? Thank you, Jane.